Welcome to Sunday Morning Science. John Perry here. Today we're going to be talking about definitions and a lot of these definition arguments that come up online. They're really common online, but they're also fairly common within science. They don't happen all the time, but when they do happen, they can sometimes last a long time. People have been arguing about what a species is for, since before Darwin, actually. One of the things that comes up a lot because I teach evolution is people will want to argue about the word theory. They'll say that evolution is just a theory and that that's a reason it should be dismissed. And so I see a lot of people, in the comment sections of my videos arguing with each other about what a theory is and so on. And there's, within the field of origin of life chemistry, there's actually a lot of problems because origin of life is a field with, you've got chemists, you've got evolutionary biologists, you've got biochemists, you have synthetic chemists, and all of these different fields, a lot of them have different jargon, different words that they use, the same word that they use in multiple different ways in these different fields. The word species, for example, in chemistry, you can have a species of molecule. And that can be confusing when a chemist is talking to an evolutionary biologist that's not used to that way of talking about molecules. And these cross-discipline fields, there's a lot of confusion. But I kind of want to talk about, there's this idea in the minds of a lot of people that there is, for every word there is a true definition. And you'll see this all the time online, people arguing about things. Like a recent really common one that I keep seeing pop up on Twitter is people are arguing about what it means to be an atheist and what the true definition of atheist is. And it seems as though people don't understand that definitions of words change over time, and that the definition really comes from it's invented by the community. The meaning of a word is invented by the community of people who speak that word, and the definition is going to change. The meaning of a word is going to change over time, and just according to how it's been used. And there's a lot of different things that end up causing those meanings to change. So language is an evolving thing. It's constantly changing. And so it's actually, if you just try to appeal to a dictionary, different people are going to use different dictionaries. Usually the dictionary has multiple definitions for a single word. And so you can have just these endless arguments about definitions. And one of the popular things to talk about is a hot dog a sandwich? And people like to argue about that on and on and on. But a lot of questions about definitions are similarly silly. They're not actually that important. But in science, there are certain times where having a very specific definition is really important. And the reason for this is that scientists are constantly talking about new things that have never been talked about in the history of the world. I mean, we discover new things and then we have to find ways to talk about them. Scientists talk about them with each other, and scientists try to talk about them with the public. And in certain cases, it actually is very, very important that we have a very specific definition for something. And so I'm going to talk today about some of those instances where it really does matter. Altruism in the field of evolutionary biology has a very specific meaning, and it's important that evolutionary biologists stick to that meaning because there's a bunch of research, mathematical analyses of different instances of altruism in biology, and there's a very specific mathematical definition for altruism in the field of evolutionary biology. And there are other instances like this. But yeah, so I've got some slides and I'm gonna go over those with you. But first I just wanna, this is actually a live show. It's been a few weeks since I've done an actual live show. So I'm getting some good mornings, a good evening from Sebastian, who apparently is on the other side of the world. We got We've got Vagarth from India. We've got Gaurav from the West Coast, so kind of early over there. Yeah, so let me pull up my slides here and get going. Feel free to ask any sorts of questions that you might have, and just do @stated space casually, so I make sure to see that. It'll be highlighted in orange. Thank you for the super chat, Gaurav. You say, thank you for creating such great science content that will be cherished for years to come. Appreciate your hard work. Well, thank you. Aki Sci Channel asks, can scientists create different words? Yes. It's extremely common for scientists to have to create words because, as I mentioned, they're talking about things for the very first time. And then another thing that happens a lot of times is that a scientist will create new definitions for old words. And so there will be specific definitions for a word within a scientific field. And so when that scientist is talking to someone in the public, it's important for them to be very clear that, in the field of evolutionary biology, when we say altruism, for example, we mean this. And it's important for them to define that with people ahead of time. Let me just pull myself back on the screen. It's important for them to make clear to their audience ahead of time that I'm now talking about this word in the context of this specific scientific field. There's actually some really interesting cases like the word dinosaur. That was an official scientific word and had a very specific meaning. And then the public kind of took it over. And the word dinosaur has a very different meaning in public, in layman's terms. So pretty much anything that's big and scary and is long extinct is considered a dinosaur by the public. Whereas in the scientific community, there's a very specific meaning for the word dinosaur. And so this causes some confusion. But usually most of the confusion between scientists and like the general public comes from scientists inventing a new word for a new meaning for a word that already existed, and then they're using it that way when they talk, and it's different than how the public uses it. But there are these weird cases where actually the public will take over a word that was invented by scientists, and just that causes chaos when you're trying to talk between scientists and lay people. Another one like that is epigenetics. Is the definition for epigenetics is it's kind of been taken over by woo land, and people are thinking that you can will yourself to have better genes and so on through epigenetic channels when you meditate with a crystal or whatever the heck people are talking about on Gaia.com and these other places. So language is this evolving, changing thing, and it's really important not to get hung up on that. This is just how it is. Language changes. Different subcultures use words in different ways. And because of that, it's important whenever you're getting in an argument with anyone, whether it be like the definition of faith, for example. That's another one that I see a lot online. People are trying to argue with each other about what faith is. Just understand that different people and different subcultures are going to have different meanings for these words. And so if you just when you're getting hung up in a conversation, just ask the person what they specifically mean when they use that word. And you might have to, in your conversation with them, just come up with a definition that you both agree with for that conversation. You're not trying to define the word for everyone for all time. You're just trying to come up with a definition for at least that one conversation so that you don't have miscommunication during that conversation. But at certain times, it is important to come up with a definition of a word that will hopefully last a while. And I'm going to talk about, this word altruism in evolutionary biology, why that's important to have a single definition that all the biologists are using for that. But back to my slides here. I got a couple questions. A couple more questions. No, looks like... Okay, so back to my slides here. So these are the words that I want to go over today. I might go over the word species as well, because that's got an interesting history in science. But I'm actually going to start here with the RNA world. So I've been getting, from time to time, I did a video on the RNA world a while ago, an animation for Stated Clearly. For those of you who don't know, I've got the second channel, Stated Clearly, which it's actually my main channel, where I do animations that are used in classrooms and so on. One of them I did was on the RNA world, and when I was studying for that and talking to researchers about it, I realized that there are actually kind of two main definitions that people use for the RNA world. And because of that, there can be a lot of confusion within the scientific community even. And there's an article that I found online a while ago called RNA World Hypothesis is Wrong, Researchers Say. And I read this article, and essentially, I'm going to overly simplify what these two researchers were saying, but they were saying that, early on, proteins were probably involved in life, and therefore the RNA world hypothesis is false. And I thought that was kind of a weird thing to say. Like, my understanding of the RNA world, having proteins doing something early on in life would not at all falsify the RNA world. But the reason that these people made that claim is because they're using kind of an older definition for the RNA world hypothesis. So when I was working on that animation for the RNA world hypothesis, I talked to lots of people, and I was getting two definitions of the RNA world. One was the idea that the first life forms used RNA to catalyze all of their chemical reactions. And that was kind of like the first, if you look at older writings in Origin of Life chemistry, that's the feeling that you get from people. That they were talking about the RNA world as this time in the history of life where RNA was doing all of the work. It was catalyzing all chemical reactions, and it was acting as genetic material for replication. The other big definition that you get for RNA world, and this is what I think a lot of people are talking about. This is actually the most common definition for RNA world today, is this idea that chains of RNA were the first entities capable of open-ended Darwinian evolution. They were being replicated. They were able to evolve through descent with modification, acted upon by selection. So that was this big, that's the thing that's most important about RNAs. It was the first thing to reach Darwinian evolution. And under that second definition, it doesn't really matter if you had simple proteins around that the environment was producing randomly, or even if you have DNA nucleotides being mixed in with those RNA nucleotides. It's these chains of RNA that were reaching open-ended Darwinian evolution. And so with that, it's clear that the authors of this, well, not the authors, but the scientists that were advising the author of this article, they were using that earlier definition, which is fairly outdated now. It's not often used. And because of that, they believed that their research had debunked the entire, RNA world hypothesis, which, a lot of other people would be like, what are you talking about? Because there is this, there's this older definition and this newer definition of the RNA world hypothesis. And you could argue that this is a problem for Origin of Life researchers that needs to be fixed. Like, all of these researchers need to get together and they need to come up with one definition for the RNA world. And I don't actually think that that's the case, because there's such a long history of people writing about the RNA world and arguing about it. And if you were to kind of, come up with one definition now, it would confuse people when they're going back and reading older literature. So I think what the best thing to do for in Origin of Life chemistry is to just teach people that are new, that are coming into the field, teach people that there are two ways that people have historically thought about this. and that they're going to bump into that in the literature. That's just how it is. The literature is filled with people talking about this in two different ways. Be aware of that. And that's the way to get around this. And this is actually, unfortunately, true about a lot of things in science. The concepts that we talk about in science, they were developed gradually over time, and there's important pieces of literature from earlier times in the scientific field and modern times in the scientific field. And when you dig into that, you just need to be aware that that the concepts have evolved over time. And so when you're reading this person's work, they're talking about it in this way. When you're reading this other person's work, they're talking about it in this newer way. And that's just how things are. That's just a consequence of how language evolves over time. I've got a couple more questions here that have popped up. Let's see. Andrew asks, how would you go about addressing individuals who may either intentionally or unintentionally be using different definitions in order to support a fallacious argument? That'll come up when I talk about the word theory, because a lot of people are, when people say, for example, that evolution is just a theory, they're saying that because they don't want to accept that evolution is significant. In really, well, I guess I could just talk about that right now. That word, let me go to the slides on that, actually, because I did prepare some stuff here. I think that's even the next one. Oh, by the way, this article in Biotechniques that used to be titled RNA World Hypothesis is Wrong. It's actually changed its title. If you look it up now, they changed it to say Saying Goodbye to the RNA World Hypothesis. So they softened it a little bit. Logical, Plausible, Probable just gave me a super chat and asks, do you actually read the Carter paper being referred to in that article? They were not using the old definition. They actually clarified specifically. In the Biotechniques paper, it seems that they were very they were saying that anything using the they were talking about the importance of proteins in the origin of the genetic code, but that if they're using the more modern definition where RNA was the first evolving entity, RNA would have been evolving long before. It would have reached open-ended Darwinian evolution, most likely, long before the origin of the genetic code. So you have, so what they're saying is that you would need proteins to be in the environment and doing important things, catalyzing important reactions, before you could get the origin of the genetic code, because they were saying that proteins are essential for adding amino acids to the transfer RNAs. And I agree with that. That's true. But the core of the ribosome that actually grabs amino acids and stitches them together to create proteins, the reaction that's happening there is actually completely done with RNA. And so to get the core of the ribosome started, which you would actually need before you have transfer RNAs, that is not, you do not need, you don't need proteins for that to happen. And the reaching open-ended Darwinian evolution, we think that you need to be able to replicate through template-directed replication. And so you're asking, did I read the paper, just the article? I actually just read this article here, and this is what I'm describing here. So from this article, what their argument was is that you need protein in order to get to the genetic code. But in the RNA world hypothesis, the idea is that we actually reached Darwinian evolution long before the genetic code. We reached Darwinian evolution, and chains of RNA were able to replicate before you have the translation system. So long before the genetic code emerged, you have chains of RNA that are acting as ribozymes and are replicating somehow through interactions with their environment. And this idea is not at all debunked by anything that comes along and requires an explanation for the origin of the genetic code. The genetic code comes later. So you reach open-ended Darwinian evolution, and then eventually, through molecules interacting with each other, you get the origin of the genetic code. And they are, at least in this article, and maybe this article is misrepresenting their actual paper, but in this article, they are saying that because the genetic code requires protein symbiosis between protein and RNA, therefore the RNA world is false. And that really, you would have to require the older definition for that to be true, for their conclusion to be true. I mean, or you would have to show that proteins can reach open-ended evolution on their own. And that is actually something that researchers are trying to figure out. There is something called the protein first hypothesis, which is suggesting that actually chains of protein can undergo a type of replication and a type of open-ended Darwinian evolution without the need of RNA. And if you look at Jay Forsyth's work, he was on here 2 weeks ago, his work has shown that you can get chains of RNA to form pretty easily in a prebiotic world. They're not replicating, but so they're not able to undergo Darwinian evolution, but they are able to be produced in an early Earth environment. And so a lot of people that use this early definition of the RNA world, they would say that Jay's work disproves the RNA world, because you're getting proteins and they can emerge in the environment, and they haven't shown that they can act as catalysts yet, but it's pretty much inevitable that they will be able to show that these early peptides, these simple proteins, can act as catalysts. And so by the first definition of the RNA world, Jay's work would have, shown that no, proteins were probably catalyzing reactions early on as well as RNA. But under the second definition, you would need to show that proteins can actually undergo Darwinian evolution. They need to undergo some sort of template-directed replication so that they can mutate and evolve. Let's see. You say, I've heard you argue that ribosomes need stabilizer proteins. Are you changing that position now? No. The early stabilizing proteins could have been easily produced by the environment, because there's lots of really short peptides that can work to stabilize chains of RNA. But those would not be evolving through Darwinian evolution. Those would be produced abiotically by the environment. And so if you look at this this type of situation, you would have chains of RNA that are actually evolving through template-directed replication. So they are undergoing open-ended Darwinian evolution, and they evolve the ability to latch on to short peptides, small proteins that are in the environment for stabilizing their own structure. And so they're interacting with these proteins in the environment, but those proteins are not able to evolve under a Darwinian type evolution. So in this scenario, some people call that a mixed RNA protein world, but in that scenario, it's still only RNA that's actually evolving through descent with modification. And so that's why a lot of people who study the RNA world hypothesis, they get frustrated when people think that somehow disqualifies the importance of RNA or RNA first. Because when they're saying RNA first, they're saying that RNA reached open-ended Darwinian evolution first. It was the first thing able to replicate through template-directed replication, where you actually get parent and offspring molecules, whereas these simple proteins, they would have been produced randomly by the environment, and they would not be able to have children, essentially. So they would not be able to pass on traits to their offspring, whereas RNA can, because it's replicating through this template-directed replication. So every other generation is essentially identical to the parent. And this is actual descent with modification in a Darwinian fashion. So it does get complicated, right? And if you look at older writings in the RNA world, they're saying that RNA was catalyzing all of the chemical reactions. And so that's why a lot of these people will say that, if there were proteins, simple proteins there as well, then the RNA world needs to be rewritten. Jay's lab is getting, I think right now they're getting like 21 MERS. So yeah, sorry. Logical, plausible, probable just asked, how many base pairs long are RNA chains? And so yeah, it's roughly, I think his are commonly 21, but he said there's some unpublished work where they're getting things that are a lot longer, but it needs to be checked. And they're getting these just through these day-night cycles. So you take a chemistry that would occur in like a puddle where there's amino acids, and he talked about it in the video that's 2 days ago. He talks in depth about it, but you're getting through very simple reactions. You get these amino acids to form chains, and yeah, they're forming 21 MERS, which we think should be catalytic at that length. But experiments still need to be done on that. They're still doing functionality experiments to see exactly what's going on when you get peptides that long. But certainly at that length, you could have them interacting with chains of RNA and doing things like stabilizing those chains of RNA. So anyway, don't want to get too derailed there, but so the theory argument, so evolution is just a theory, and this goes back to the question that I was getting from Gaurav on intentional, from Andrew on intentional people who are intentionally trying to misunderstand something. There's this common argument in the anti-evolution community where they say that evolution is just a theory, and so it should be disregarded. But of course, there are, germ theory. It's like saying germ theory is just a theory. In science, when we talk about theories, oftentimes, but not always, we're talking about a very stable concept. And this is confusing because, if you look at the Oxford English Dictionary, you've got two definitions for theory. So the first definition is a scheme or system of ideas or statements held as an explanation or account of a group of facts or phenomena, a hypothesis that has been confirmed or established by observation or experiment, and is propounded or accepted as accounting for the known facts, a statement for what are held to be general laws, principles, or causes of something known or observed. And this is what a lot of scientists talk about when they're talking about a scientific theory. They're talking about something that's very well established. It's this overarching idea that encompasses a bunch of observations, it could be laws, it could be all sorts of things, that encompasses and explains them. And this is what germ theory does. This is what the theory of evolution does. It's this broad, overarching theory, this framework that describes all of these facts and helps us make sense of them. And we actually use these theories to derive testable hypotheses that we then use to as the foundation of all of our experiments. And then the second sense of the word theory is a hypothesis proposed as an explanation. Hence, a mere hypothesis, speculation, conjecture, an idea or set of ideas about something. So this is like your uncle's theory about the virus, or kind of this really casual sense of the word theory. And so people will try and say that evolution is just like your uncle's crazy theory about, who masterminded this virus. Bill Gates and his evil flu that he invented, right? So people try to conflate those two, and actually, there's fairly, unfortunately, there's good reason for them to be, I guess you could say, allowed to do that, because if we look at how scientists use the word theory, they're actually not using it consistently either. A lot of people want to say that scientists use the word theory in a very specific way, but that's actually not the case. And Richard Dawkins, back in 2015, he pointed us out. He says, "Let's simply give up on trying to explain the special scientific meaning of theory. It is begging to be misunderstood by laymen eager to misunderstand. And even scientists are not consistent in their usage." And I've got an example here of two scientists talking about the exact same thing. One uses the word hypothesis, the other uses the word theory. So the paper on the left by Michael Treisman. He is an evolutionary psychologist, and within the field of evolutionary biology in general, people are very careful to use the word theory and hypothesis differently. They use the word theory for things that are really well established, and they use hypothesis for things that are not so established, kind of newer ideas. And so he talks about his hypothesis of motion sickness. And in this paper, it's actually super interesting. His hypothesis is that the reason we get motion sickness is because you have visual information and information from the vestibular system, so your balance system, which is inside your ears, actually, those two little loops inside your ears that give you a sense of balance through the little hairs that sense, which direction your head is facing. He's saying that what we know that motion sickness is caused by a mismatch between what we're seeing and what we're sensing inside of our ears for balance. And he proposes that the reason that causes motion sickness is that this is an evolved trait. When you eat a toxin that causes neurological interruption, that neurotoxin, is going to cause a mismatch between the information you're getting from your eyes and the information you're getting from your inner ear. And because of that, this is a really strong cue for your body that you've just eaten something toxic and that you should probably vomit that back up. And so what he's saying is that this is an evolved trait to make you vomit when you eat a toxin. And because now humans have invented cars and boats and all these different tools that we use for transportation, that actually causes, when we're in a car, we can get this mismatch between what we're seeing and what we're feeling in our ears, because we're moving at rates that we did not evolve to move at, and we're moving in ways we did not evolve to move in. And so that can trigger this life-saving system accidentally. And so this is it's kind of like an evolutionary accident, basically. So this is a really cool hypothesis that he came up with, and there's actually really, really good evidence that, this is probably true. But there's another guy who's writing about this, and he actually quotes that old paper, but he calls it a theory. And in his paper, he says, "Many theories of motion sickness have been proposed over the years. The evolutionary theory holds that motion sickness is essentially a response to poisoning." So this is kind of funny, because you've got the exact same concept being talked about. One person calls it a hypothesis. Actually, the person who came up with it in the first place calls it a hypothesis. The other person calls it a theory. And so we see here that there's not common word usage even in the scientific community. And if you look actually in Oxford has a dictionary specifically for scientific terms, and in their entry on the word theory, they also say this. They say scientists in different fields use the word theory and hypothesis in very different ways. And they say, in general, scientists mean this. But there's not consistency. And one of the things that a lot of people tend to think is that the dictionary dictates how a word needs to be used, but actually dictionary writers, they're actually looking at how people are already using these words. They look at how people use these words kind of in the wild, right? And then they write their definitions based on that. And this is why dictionaries usually have multiple definitions for the same word. This is why dictionaries update themselves from time to time, because words develop new meanings. Words have different meanings in different subcultures. And so it's very important, if you think there's confusion in your conversation you're having with someone, it's very important that you try and clarify with the person you're having a discussion with as to what it is that they actually mean. Let's see, I've got a couple of questions here. Let me go back to... The International Astronomical Union came together to redefine planet and demoted Pluto. Has the world of genetic biology ever come together like this? So, sort of. That's actually a really rare case where people actually come together to redefine a word for the entire, community. In genetics, this does happen, but I've never seen anyone get fully on board when this does happen. There's always lots of people that argue about it. So, and the word gene is actually one that we're going to talk about here, because the word gene still has two very different meanings. And evolutionary biologists use it in one way, and geneticists use it in a different way. And so we're going to talk about that. But yeah, that is a really interesting example where you actually kind of have, a universal definition switch within a field. And that can sometimes happen. Maybe that should happen in origin of life chemistry, for example. Maybe they should come together and come up with a solid definition for the RNA world hypothesis, but I don't, or what's meant by that. When people say RNA first, what they actually mean by that. But I don't think it's going to happen, mainly because there's so much diversity when you go back into the literature and you see how people are using that term. I think the best way to move forward is just to tell people that, look, there's different ways that people have thought about this in the past, and there's different ways that people think about this right now. Just be aware of that. The other question: why do those chemicals, RNA or protein, have the tendency to replicate? Why use energy to fight entropy, not live in equilibrium? The ability to replicate, it has to do with the way that bases are attracted to their opposite base in chains of RNA and in chains of DNA. That's what allows them to replicate. So if you have a single-sided chain of RNA and you have free nucleotides, they're going to want to base pair with that chain, find their partners on that chain. And that ends up giving rise to the ability for replication to happen. And there are aspects of template-directed RNA replication that don't yet work in a prebiotically plausible setting. So RNA replication has not actually been shown to work completely in a prebiotically plausible setting. But people who are working in the RNA world think that there probably was a certain type of environment that would allow that to happen. So they're searching for that type of environment. There are other people that are saying maybe proteins were able to replicate in a similar fashion, and so they're looking into that. And there are other people that are saying RNA, the problems with RNA are too big. We're going to look at proto-RNA or other systems altogether that might be able to replicate and undergo Darwinian evolution. But that's the general idea. Nucleotides can attract their partners, and that gives rise to the ability to replicate and actually, produce what are essentially our offspring that can undergo mutations as well. Aki Sci Channel says scientific theories are different than casual, normal public theories. In most cases, that's true, but you will hear scientists use the word in a looser term as well. So yeah, it's an overloaded term, yes, as Joe Mako says. So I guess kind of to get back to the question that Andrew asked, like, how do you deal with this when people are trying to purposely misunderstand a word to win an argument? I guess just point it out. Like, arguing over the definition of a word is actually not what we're trying to do when we're having a scientific argument. Like, we need to know that these are just sideshows. Like, you can get off on a tangent, and if someone's trying to spend all their energy arguing about a word, it's probably because they don't have a real argument. And so I guess you could just point that out. Like, in the case of theory, you could just say, look, there are these two different uses of the word theory. When scientists talk about the theory of evolution or germ theory, they're talking about it in this really strong sense. Like, there is scientific consensus that evolution happened, that evolution is happening, that evolution is a thing. There is no doubt in the vast majority of evolutionary biologists that evolution by natural selection is the way that all life on Earth diversified into the forms that we see today. And this is an idea that has extremely strong consensus. And I think that's the way to go about dealing with this argument, is just point that out. Does all observed replication require polymerase? It requires polymerase or some sort of enzyme that we have not been able to find in a prebiotically plausible environment. So if you look at my video on the RNA world hypothesis, we talk about this being like the major thing, the major thing that is an impediment to the RNA world hypothesis. I believe that there actually have been cases where they're using activated nucleotides, and you don't need a polymerase. But these activated nucleotides, we don't know how those would have occurred in a prebiotic environment. So it doesn't really solve the problem. The big unsolved problem in RNA world is, how do you get backbone binding to form on these nucleotide chains that are forming on their template strand? That is the big unsolved problem in the RNA world. And there is a possible solution that's been worked on by a guest who's going to come on here in a couple of weeks. We don't have a date yet, but he's been working on a proto-RNA that we think overcomes this problem and can actually undergo backbone binding without any sort of enzyme being required to help. So we'll be looking at that in a couple of weeks. It's a completely different system. It's not RNA, but the system can actually, it forms chains very much similar to RNA, and I believe it can actually bind to RNA. It can base pair with RNA, which makes it a really interesting, plausible proto-RNA alternative. But he's going to be on the show to explain it in a lot more depth, and I don't understand his system nearly well enough to comment on it in depth here. Yeah, there is no observed, if you look at the RNA world video, there is no observed full-on RNA replication, either without catalysts or without pre-activated nucleotides, and we don't think we could get pre-activated nucleotides in a prebiotic system. So no, the RNA world does not work start to finish how we currently think of it. That's why origin of life researchers are looking for either prebiotic catalysts that could make it work, or alternatives to RNA nucleotides that could make it work. All right, so the next section here, yeah, we're going to talk about a gene, the word gene. So the word gene, the word gene was invented. It came up with, biologists were talking about genes long before DNA was discovered, long before DNA was discovered as the molecule that genes are made of, right? And so the word gene is actually, in its original earlier definitions, it has nothing to do with a specific chemical. It was just defined as a unit of inheritance. So actually I have my second definition down here. So a gene is the smallest unit of heritable information. So this definition is agnostic to what type of molecule a gene is made out of. And the modern definition that you'll see a lot of geneticists use is that a gene is a stretch of nucleic acid, so it could be either DNA or RNA. It's a stretch of nucleic acid that either codes for a protein or acts as a template for a functional chain of RNA. So that's how a lot of biochemists define a gene. And in this definition, you have large stretches of DNA that don't count as genes. So actually most of your genome is not genetic by this definition, because they're only counting a gene as the actual part of DNA that gets transcribed into RNA and is then either used as a functional RNA or translated into protein. And so it's a very specific definition of the word gene. A lot of evolutionary biologists argue that that's so against the earlier definitions of a gene that it's too specific. Dawkins argued that we should use the word cistron for that, for the way that biochemists define the word gene today. And I actually kind of agree with him. It would have been nice if people would have continued to use this word cistron, because it was actually an alternative that was used early on. Geneticists kind of knew that there was this problem, and they came up with their own unique word, which is cistron, for the stretch of DNA that's used to make RNA, and that RNA then goes on to make protein. They actually had a word for it, but for whatever reason, the word gene became popular for that. And this is unfortunate, because when we're studying the evolution of genes, we don't care just about the protein coding region. We also care about the regulatory regions in DNA and how those evolve, because a mutation in a regulatory region can have a dramatic change on the phenotype of an organism. And, we want to say, there's if you say that there's a gene that affects eye color, well, it's not technically correct if you're using the modern biochemical definition of a gene, because a lot of the changes that affect eye color happen in regulatory regions, not in protein coding regions. So it causes just all sorts of confusion when scientists are talking about a gene. And so when I talk to evolutionary biologists like Stuart West, he says I just use the older definition. I consider a gene to be the smallest unit of heritable information, and I am actually still agnostic as to what type of molecule is considered a gene. And so if we find that there are things aside from DNA that are heritable, that cause heritable changes in offspring and can be passed on from those offspring to their offspring, I would consider that to be a gene as well. And he thinks that, we don't know enough about how information is transferred from parent to child to really say for sure that stretches of DNA or stretches of RNA are the only things that can cause heritable information to be passed from parent to child. So he and a lot of other evolutionary biologists still use this simpler definition and this older definition. a gene is the smallest unit of heritable information. So when they have conversations, they will say that. And they have to say that because it's being used so differently in these different fields of biology right now. And that's unfortunate. It would be nice if the entire community would come together and decide to change the definitions here. Say that the way that biochemists are using the word gene, they're going to stop doing that and they're going to call it a cistron. In the way that evolutionary biologists are using the word gene, that's going to be the norm, or vice versa. You could say that the evolutionary biologists need to come up with a new word for how they're using it. But that has not happened. And the field of biology is so big, and the field of genetics is so big, that I don't think it's going to happen. There's no king of science, right? And so it's very, very difficult for people to come in hindsight and change the definition of a word like this. Gene is also short for Eugene. Let's not forget. Yeah. Okay, I think that deals with all the questions around that. Kind of ends things for the topic of genes here. And the last word that I really want to talk about is altruism, because this is an example of where we really do want a very specific scientific definition for the word altruism in a specific field. And different fields might talk about this differently. And that's okay, so long as people are careful to define it at the start of their conversations. And this is what Stuart West has to do when he's talking about the word gene. He has to carefully define what he means by the word gene when he's starting a conversation. And he'll do this in his papers and so on. But altruism means a lot of different things to us, right? If you just think, what does it mean to be altruistic? The common definition is that altruism is unselfish regard for or devotion to the welfare of others. And by this definition, you could say that a mother is altruistic to her child. And she everything she's doing for her child is an example of altruism. An evolutionary biologist would disagree because they define altruism in a very specific way that's important in the field of evolutionary biology. So here is an article on biological altruism. In evolutionary biology, an organism is said to behave altruistically when its behavior benefits other organisms at a cost to itself. The cost and benefits are measured in terms of reproductive fitness, or expected number of offspring. So by behaving altruistically, an organism reduces the number of offspring it is likely to produce itself, but boosts the number of offspring other organisms are likely to produce. Biological altruism is specifically defined by evolutionary biologists as a decrease in your own reproductive fitness by increasing someone else's reproductive fitness. So a mother helping her own child is actually not an example of altruism in this case. And actually the way that E.O. Wilson defines altruism, I think he's actually defining it differently, which is why there's a bunch of evolutionary biologists that were upset about his last book because he's written a public-facing book where he actually has redefined this when there are hundreds of papers that use this one specific definition, and there's a whole system of mathematical models that show when altruism will evolve that he has ignored. I believe that was the problem with it, but unfortunately, I don't know enough to say for sure because I haven't read his book. I've just read a couple of arguments that biologists wrote about his book, so I don't know enough to be fair in my assessment of what he did there. But I think that is what he did. Is he redefined altruism in a way that was basically disregarding thousands of papers. I don't know if thousands, but years and years, and at least hundreds of papers on this subject and models that are based on this. So what we find is that close relatives can act altruistically. They can evolve genes that will cause them to sacrifice their own reproductive fitness for a benefit in reproductive fitness for one of their close relatives, because those close relatives will also have that gene. And there are lots of examples of this where you have like siblings that stay in the nest. Instead of reproducing on their own, they help their parents raise offspring and so on. And the reason for this is that, every organism that has that gene that causes them to behave in a way or, end up helping other relatives that have that same gene to reproduce, that can boost that specific gene's frequency in the population, just like having more offspring of your own could boost that specific gene's frequency in the population. And so we found a way that true altruism in this sense can evolve. Even organisms will die for their siblings, and natural selection can actually favor that behavior if the dynamics are set up correctly. So there are very specific situations where altruism will evolve and where they won't. And because we have this large body of work in the field of evolutionary biology and all of these mathematical models that show how this works, it is very important that evolutionary biologists understand this definition, how it's been used historically in their field, and what that means. And that's why people tend to get angry in that field if you use the word wrong. So there are lots of situations that are similar to this in different fields where you have, we call this the scientific jargon, right? And if you misuse a word or use it differently, it can cause quite a bit of chaos in a field. It can cause the communication can just break down. And so it's important to try and, maintain some sort of stability with some of these words. But in other cases, it's just because of the way that language evolves over time, it can be really, really tricky. And so the big take home that I hope people understand from this whole conversation is language is messy. Words change over time. Definitions change over time. And when you're having a conversation and you're butting heads with someone, it's important to figure out if the actual concepts that you're arguing about are fundamentally different. Is your disagreement really about the actual concepts? Are you having an actual disagreement, or is there just a simple definition problem that you're having with your debate partner? Is there a definition difference that's causing all of your problems? And a lot of times it's a silly definition issue, and it can be fixed if you just explain what you mean by the specific word and get them to explain what they mean. And it can be fixed if just, at least for this conversation, you come up with an agreement on what these terms mean, because language evolves. And in these scientific fields, when you have these conflicts, if there is an authoritative group in a specific scientific field, maybe you can get a top-down approach where the actual definition is dictated, which is what we did with the word planet. So now Pluto is not a planet. But in a lot of cases, it's going to be too difficult. You need to just be clear. If you're writing a paper on altruism, maybe you need to be clear about the definition of altruism in the top of your paper, how you are going to be using that word in that paper. If you're having a conversation with the public, again, and you're going to use a word like altruism, be clear with how you're using that word within that conversation, and just be okay with the fact that other people define it differently. Other people use the word dinosaur differently. They use the word, all sorts of different words. So, that's it. We just avoid these conflicts by being extremely clear with any words that might be problematic. Tell your audience how you define those, and be okay with your audience defining it differently elsewhere. be okay with different groups defining it differently elsewhere. The word atheism is one of these that some people have decided that if you do not believe in gods, you are an atheist. Others think that you have to have certainty that God did not exist to be an atheist. And so there's this argument going on the internet right now, which is kind of funny. They're trying to decide who has the true definition of the word atheist. But of course, what I'm saying here is that a true definition doesn't really exist. There's multiple ways to think about these words. Meaning emerges in a group, a community of speakers. That's where the meaning emerges, and that's going to change over time. I've got some comments on how Wilson is using the words altruism. Let's see. Wilson uses the term eusociality. Not all members of a group do not have to be related to contribute to the passing on your genes. Sorry, I think there was you might have typed that too fast there. I didn't quite understand that. Not all members of a group do not have to be related to contribute to the passing on your genes. I'm not totally sure what you mean there. If I have got any last minute questions, or Vaughn, Reese, if you want to restate that, I'm not quite understanding what you said there. I'll address that. But yeah, I feel like this is an important thing just to keep in mind with debates in general, debates within science, confusions within science. This is why, again, with these RNA world things, you'll see some people argue that the RNA world has been debunked, and you'll see other people saying, no, it hasn't. In order to debunk the RNA world, you need to show that some other molecule can actually undergo Darwinian evolution. That's the only way to fully debunk the RNA world hypothesis. Fully derail it is to find a better one where you have actual Darwinian evolution achieved, which has not yet happened. So yeah, this is the sideshow argument that tends to derail really important arguments, is these silly definition arguments. Aki Sci Channel asks or says, so altruism is supported by natural selection? Yes. So this type of altruism that I'm talking, this very specific type of altruism where one organism actually sacrifices its well-being for its reproductive success for a sibling, for a close relative, that definitely does happen in evolutionary biology. You have to have very specific circumstances to get that to evolve, but you can get that to evolve. All right. Well, it looks like I'm not getting other questions here. And I know there's a little bit of a lag, but yeah, that was fun. I will see next week. I'll do a Sunday morning science, but I'm not sure if I'm going to have a guest or not. So if there's specific things you would like me to talk about, let me know. If I don't have a guest, I'll try and just answer some questions that people are sending me. So if you can send me an email at john@statedclearly.com. That's my email address. I will, maybe I'll do another Q&A, evolutionary Q&A next week, unless I have a guest. So I might have a guest, but I might not. And Aki Sci Channel says I sent you an email. I'll look at that. And it looks like there are no more questions on these topics for today. So with that, so long for now. Stay curious.